Yeah. And we're live! Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny from the channel The Story Ain't Over, which is the channel you're here at. And I'm joined by the wonderful and amazing Bear from the channel A2 Brody. They are so awesome, and I'm so glad they're here to join me for the discussion for Crooked Hallelujah by Kelly Jo Ford. All of you hopefully have read this one, but as we always start off these lives, please leave me an emoji. So, a heart one if you've read the book and a smiley if you haven't finished it. And we'll start from there. And I'm going to get Bear to let us know what Crooked Hallelujah is all about.
Okay, so Cricket Hallelujah, I would say it's historical literary fiction. It's a multi-perspective intergenerational novel that follows this family of three Cherokee women and just like their lives and the struggles that they face due to colonization. I would say
Mm-hmm.
is the best way to summarize it. Not much of
Yeah.
a plot, but that's the vibe.
No, I totally agree. That's a good description, and I feel like it hits like the main idea of what the book's about. Also because it's like a literary fiction, and I find literary fictions tend to be a slightly harder to explain in like a plot way because there's not really any plot. It's just life happening, right? So totally feel that. I'm really excited to talk about this one because first of all, it's our first Indigenous pick ever, which I'm so happy we got to do, and that you're joining us for this live show. Context for anyone who's watching and sort of curious about how this came about or how we chose this pick. Bear and I were looking for specifically Cherokee Indigenous books, and we had a hard time, which just speaks to the whole, issue with publishing, with the stories that we tell and that we celebrate. So I'm glad that we're getting to celebrate the story today. But I guess we'll start it off with just getting general thoughts on what we feel about the book. What are your general thoughts, Bear? How did you feel about this?
I liked it a lot.
Mhm.
I feel like I started to like it a little bit less as the story progressed. Like the farther we got
Mhm.
into it, I was kind of like falling out of it sometimes. And I
Mhm.
think that probably has to do with the fact that it's like non-linear
Yes.
and there's a lot of like jumping around in time frames and stuff. And I love non-linear novels, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
I've just there's a certain way I like them done.
Mhm.
And I feel like I think this is a debut as well.
Yes, I think so too.
So it's like I don't know that it was I enjoyed it, but I don't know that I think it would have worked better as a linear novel. Like, have we gotten
Mhm.
the first part from the oldest generation all the way down to the youngest?
Yes. Yeah, I definitely think it was a choice to do it in that nonlinear format, and in some ways I slightly enjoyed it because I like trying to piece things together, but I do agree. I think it would have been a little bit more emotionally impactful if we had gotten things like front to end, beginning to end. Um, because I feel like I got like pushed out of the story every time it got jostled around. But I totally agree with you. I think overall I really love the book. I think there's so much heart to it, which is like my favorite part about this book. But again, yeah, I see what you mean about the sort of non-linear format and just the way that the story is not just like one big long narrative. It like gets chopped up, and so it's harder to follow, I guess, is what I was feeling. And I think that was a similar vibe that I got from some of the people in the discussion as well, on Fable. But thank you for those of you who are joining, even those of you who didn't get the chance to finish the book. Okay, so we've talked about some general thoughts. If you had to, do you rate books there, by the way?
Yes, I do a
Okay,
5-star
so
rating.
what would you rate this book?
I gave it a 4. I
Nice.
gave it a
Okay.
4.
Okay. I think I would give it like around the same. Maybe like a 3.54 just because I didn't love the format, but I still really loved like the heart of it. Like I was so touched by the end, especially like those final moments with the book. And we'll get into that and we'll get into spoilers as well later on. But I would love to hear what everyone else rated the book or generally thought of it. So let us know your thoughts in the comments. Um, Okay, so I guess one thing I wanted to, or actually, let's start with what you're feeling, Bear. What is a topic or maybe a character that you'd like to discuss first?
I think the biggest thing in this book that I want to discuss is like the
Hmm.
tone.
Hmm.
Because for it to be a book that has a lot of heart, there's also kind of like this acceptance and like
Hmm.
resigning yourself to the situation instead of trying to improve the
Yes.
situation.
Yes.
I wouldn't say that the characters are necessarily very like active in trying to fix their
Hmm.
situations. And I think that if you don't read a lot of indigenous literature, you're not going to be familiar with that. It's
Mm.
very prevalent in like There by Tommy Orange, The Break by Katarina Vermette. Um, and those are also multi-perspective novels too, funnily enough. Um, I think it just comes down to the fact that a lot of Goodreads reviews that I read for this book, they said that
Hmm.
they didn't understand like the holy roller aspect and like the religious aspect and
Mm.
why can't you just fix things? And I think that what
That's a
not a lot
weird
of people
perspective.
understand is just how traumatic like being in a residential school is and
Yes.
how that affects all the way down your line. Because in the book it was mentioned, I think that Reenie's mother or
Hmm.
grandmother, one of the two, had been in a residential school
I think it was her grandmother. Yeah.
and like that it gets so dark and all you had to do
Yeah.
was tell me that in the book and I'm like I'm
Yeah.
in. I understand everything, but for someone who doesn't have the context of like just how like abusive
Hmm.
and manipulative and stuff they can be, like they break you. So I
Hmm.
think that that's something that's a misinterpreted part of the book. It's not that they gave up, it was
Hmm.
essentially beaten out of the family.
Yes. No, exactly. And I love that you brought that up because I think, as you said, like a lot of people don't have this perspective. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're reading. And without that context, you're lost and you make assumptions and you're just saying these very sort of ignorant things about why can't they just change things. Yeah. We all have so many histories and things that inform our present day, and I think this is no different. Yeah, I totally get what you mean. And I think one thing that was so interesting to me about this book, and I find a lot of people who come from, very difficult histories, have this sort of tendency to refer to their past in a very not emotionless, but I want to say like, they are so used to this, and it's just like a part of life, and they will just say it without much emotion. You
Right.
know what I mean? And like this book sort of states these very difficult things and it just throws them in there without, digging too deep into them because this is the reality that they're facing. And I think that I felt that across the entire narrative through the different generations of women and all the things that they go through. So yeah, I totally see what you're saying about that. I'd love to get more thoughts on this as well from anyone in who's watching as well. We've got some ratings as well. A couple people gave it threes. Some people were struggling as well. Totally understand. But yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think um, in terms of like the other things that you personally caught on, I'd love to hear um what they are, Bear, in terms like so you talked about like the residential school. Was there anything else in there that you feel like someone who hasn't read a lot of Indigenous literature or doesn't come from an Indigenous background may have missed as well? I'm putting you on the spot, but I'd love to know.
So I think it was a really interesting choice for
Yeah.
all of the perspectives, like the main perspectives at least,
Hmm.
to be from women,
Yes.
because the Cherokee, we are a matriarchal people. So
Yeah.
everything comes through the mother.
Yeah.
So I like the fact that it's not that we don't have male perspectives on this book because we do, but
Hmm.
they're definitely more just like side things.
Hmm.
I thought it was a really good and intentional choice for it to be focused on women, especially whenever you look at the disproportionate rates of not just abuse, but like, how dark are we gonna get here? Like,
Yeah. Go for it.
okay,
Go for
so
it.
like if you look at these statistics, like Indigenous
Yeah.
women are raped, murdered,
Hmm.
domestic violence across the board. I think they have the highest amount. Like
Hmm.
the stats are the highest. So I think that taking this perspective of these three different women who have gone through very different things in their lives, but
Hmm.
it all ties back to colonization,
Hmm.
was a very interesting and intentional choice.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that you brought that up and like the idea of the matriarch as well. You know, giving power into like their perspective and allowing them to tell their story in this book, I think is really wonderful and like empowering as well. But again, like these are women who are put into the worst positions ever. So, this is just like a small grace that we are giving them. But yeah, I love that you mentioned that. And I think I really enjoyed hearing all of their perspectives and seeing how different they were and how they had very different outlooks on life as well, depending on, what they had gone through. Um, I think Lula was like the mother at the beginning, at least. And she has like a very religious background and she thinks about things very differently versus her daughter, Justine. And I found that just so relatable as well.
Mhm.
And I just love seeing how they were all so different. I think we can sometimes think about people's perspectives in a very like standard or linear way, and like we are so informed by our parents, but these women were very different in their own ways, which I loved. And I love that they were learning from each other as well, especially Justine is sort of learning from her daughter at the end, learns from her mother at the end. She was not very religious and then she becomes more religious towards the end. So those are all things I really really loved. Yeah. um okay, so I guess I would love to hear what your favorite aspect of the book was, and also your least favorite aspect of the book. I think this is something I always ask about each of the um book picks that we have.
Mhm.
So let me know.
So I think my favorite aspect, like I said earlier, was just like the general tone.
Hmm.
Um, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very well written.
Hmm.
My least favorite aspect is probably the structure of the book. Like I
Hmm.
said, I'm fine with non-linear books. I think this was an ambitious book for a debut.
Yes.
Um, I think my least favorite part is I don't feel like it was handled as successfully as it could have been as
Hmm.
far as the like non-linear aspect goes.
Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And do you like, if you had to see it executed a little bit better, what would you have liked to seen?
Um, Maybe something more along the lines of like I always reference There by Tommy Orange because I feel like
Yeah.
that's just like my peak, like my cap for
Okay.
books. So maybe something along the lines of that where you don't just get the three perspectives, you get more people in the family. We follow
Mm-hmm.
the grandma all the way back to the residential school. I think that would have given some more context to people who don't have that context already.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think maybe like a wider cast of characters. I've heard a lot of
Hmm.
people complain about how many characters there are in this book, but for me there
Hmm.
like weren't enough.
Mm,
um, yeah, I would have liked to have seen
interesting.
a wider cast of characters because with multi-perspective books, I like it to be upward. My preference is like upwards of 10.
Okay.
Like I like a good like 14 character
Oh my
situation.
God, ambitious. I love.
Yeah, I wish the side characters, even though I don't want them to be the focus of the story, I think that
Yeah.
fleshing them out a little bit more would have been interesting.
Yes, I do agree with that. Yeah, I think fleshing out the side characters would have added a lot of color to the story and context as well. I think because the main characters' perspectives were a little bit limited, I felt like a lot of the side characters were just passing ships. And I wanted to know more about them and how they were affecting everything else going on in the story. But I
Yeah,
like that you have, you're one of the few people I know who actually likes upwards of 10,
I
perspectives in a book.
do.
Yeah.
I
That's
love a
pretty
big
interesting.
cast, but I
Yeah.
think also if you look at like historically, my favorite books are very much like character driven or just
Okay.
like no plot, just vibes.
Oh,
So
okay, okay.
I don't need a plot to enjoy the book, but what I really fall in with is like the atmosphere, the tone, and the characters. So I
Hmm.
feel like out of those three things, I got two of them
Okay.
successfully. Yeah.
Okay, yes, that makes sense. Yeah. So we are quite different readers, I will tell you. I am more of a plot person and I
Mhm.
usually like less perspectives, so that it's a little bit more focused and that with the movie, sorry, the plot and like the story moves along better. But and I'm, yeah, I struggle with books that are mostly vibes and less plot,
Mhm.
but it really depends on the one. And I think this one was one of the few books that is more vibes, less plot, that really like kept me going throughout the book. Like I wanted to know where these women's lives were going to go, and where they were going to end up. And I liked that it was a sort of long look at their lives as well. It wasn't just a short moment in each of their lives. It was like across them. And we, see Lula at her end, and we see Justine at her end as well. So I found that really fascinating. I love long looks at characters
Mhm.
and like how they grow and change, I think. Um, so yeah, I really enjoyed that part of the book. I'm just going to go through some of the comments. I didn't always see the difference between the different perspectives and voices in the book. They felt too similar for being such different personalities. I think that's valid, but I did feel the difference, I think, in the way that they would look at life. um, and the way that they observed things also. I think Justine's, I'm getting her name right. Yeah, Justine's perspective was very colored by her mother's presence in her life, whereas Rainey, um, she was sort of more disjointed, in my opinion, um,
Mhm.
and had a lot of other concerns as well. So I think it just depends. Um, Lola saying I felt like the end was rushed a bit. It could have been me. I can see that. What do you think, Bear?
I enjoyed the ending,
Hmm.
but I do see how people would view it as rest because, like I said, I don't need a plot. I don't need it to tie up
Hmm.
nicely. I love open endings,
Yeah.
so I feel like everything that happens toward the
Hmm.
end. I also thought it was really interesting, if we're talking about
Hmm.
the ending, to end
Yeah,
this
go for
book
it.
in 2012. Whenever, like, the whole, oh, the Mayan calendar, it's the apocalypse sort of
Hmm.
situations going on. One of my favorite quotes, I can't remember who it's by right now, but it was
Hmm.
a quote about indigenous speculative fiction and science
Hmm.
fiction. And it says that a lot of people don't realize that Native people we've already been through an apocalypse.
Yes.
Right. Native Americans have already been through an apocalypse. We are currently living in a dystopia, essentially.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting to take this very, I don't want to say dry, but I can't think of a better word right now.
Okay.
Like I
Yeah.
said earlier, like this very toned down novel where everyone's just accepting
Hmm.
what's happening to them. And the one while the rest of the world is freaking out
Hmm.
over, oh no, we're all gonna die, they're just
Yeah.
kind of like, yeah, like it happens. you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, no, I love that you brought that up because I loved the like social commentary in that last bit and how again like everyone's freaking out, but they have lived through the apocalypse, as you said. And I actually personally really loved the ending, like that part three. Partly because I love like vignettes and like parts in movies where you're getting like little snippets of characters, that kind of thing. So I really enjoyed that actually, and I liked seeing how Justine and her daughter's relationship changes in that last little bit of the story. And so I found it like it got me. You could say it was rushed, but also I felt like it got me to the end quicker. Like I wanted to
Yeah.
know what was happening faster.
Mhm.
Um, so I definitely see that. Yeah. Um, okay. So we talked about the ending. I would love to know from you, I guess, and maybe to you, some of the parts of the books that were shocking or surprising weren't as surprising to you, but what did you find to be the most like shocking or surprising part of the book?
I don't know. I feel like a lot of the stuff I was like the
Hmm.
twists, I guess. I was just
Yeah.
kind of like, okay, yeah, that's what happens. You know.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
um I think the parts that shocked me the most though were like the natural
Hmm.
disasters.
Mm.
Like like you have
Hmm.
tornadoes and
Yeah.
hurricanes or not hurricanes, just everything that's going on and I'm like,
Yeah.
"Oh, I didn't know we were going to get into like climate fiction territory."
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And as someone
Yeah.
who grew up in the South in a very
Hmm.
religious area, like Tornado Alley, I was just like,
Hmm.
oh God, this is very close to home. I don't like this very much.
Oh my God. Oh, I didn't even think of that. Yeah. That's interesting to get your perspective. Like, you're very used to this and like it's like something that,
Yeah.
you know, you're very familiar with. Whereas I like, live in Canada and where I live, it's not something that happens often.
Right.
Especially natural disasters. And I think the idea is so terrifying to me, the idea of like having to leave, all of your belongings, everything that you know. That whole part where Justine, I think, is like packing up her stuff. She's intending to leave her husband, and then it turns out, this big tornado is coming. I think it was the tornado at that point.
Yeah.
And then she has to leave everything, and she has this like panicky moment where she can't find the baby photos, and I
Mhm.
was like, I would be that person freaking out over the baby photos. So that was like super super relatable, and I think
Mhm.
um, yeah, that was, I do agree about like the climate stuff being a shocking part of this because I didn't think it was going to go into that territory either as
Mhm.
well. I think what was shocking and surprising to me, not that these things were happening, but the way that they were sort of portrayed in the book, I guess. We talked about how the book takes a pretty, as you said, like dry tone to what's going on. So I think that surprised me. That tone surprised me. I think like in the very first chapter and like some of the first few pages, we get the sense that Justine has been raped.
Yeah.
And immediately I was like on alert
Mhm.
as I was reading those pages, and I was like, oh. And I wish I had included triggers for people who are reading, but so hopefully everyone was okay. But I know that always like gets me, and I was like, we're going deep, and I like that the book didn't shy away from that stuff.
Mhm.
Also, I think it was very real, but also it kept that perspective that this felt very everyday and like not, which is like sad to say, but it's like this is the reality, and it didn't shy away from that. I think didn't try to
Mhm.
sugarcoat it, which I really appreciated. Um, just picking up a comment here. Lois said I listened on audio, so getting the different voices and perspectives. Yeah, I listened on audio as well, and I actually liked the audio. What do you
I wish
think?
I would have done the audiobook. I do.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was hoping when I was reading it, I was like, you know what? If we had like some voices going on,
yeah.
it would help like differentiate the characters a little bit better. Were there multiple voice actors or was it just one
So
person?
So I actually did the same thing. I didn't read, I was reading the physical, and then halfway through I was like, I think an audiobook would help. So I found one, and I put it on. And it's I think one singular narrator, but she does a really good job of differentiating her voice.
Okay.
Especially with some of the side characters. I think it really helps with the side characters mostly because the main three female characters, I think all three of them sounded pretty similar, but the side characters I like felt them a little bit more, and it got a little less confusing, I think, with the
Okay.
audiobook. Yeah. So definitely helpful for anyone who's like watching this and hasn't read the book, or you're trying to finish it. I recommend the audiobook because it was worth it. It's only on Audible though, which is unfortunate, but that's where it is. Okay, so I feel like there was a lot of moments in here that I just want to talk about, and I wrote like little notes in here. I what did I think of the little parts of the book that were written from different perspectives? So not from our three main women, but from those side characters. What did you think of them?
So I really enjoyed it.
Hmm.
Like I said earlier, I love a big cast.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's interesting because this book is so like kind of hyper focused on the lives of these three women
Hmm.
and how everything has affected them in their personal life. That it's really interesting to see how these very like introspective people relate to the world
Hmm.
around them. So
Yeah.
my favorite perspective. I can't remember his name. It was the male perspective with like the two lesbians that had moved in next door.
Yes, it was Mosley. Yes.
Mostly, I was
I
going to
love
say
that one.
Odie. I couldn't remember his name, but I thought
Yeah.
it was really interesting that we had
Hmm.
spent 150 200 pages reading about this family, and to him she's
Hmm.
just this like nice lady that offered him a ride one time.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of helps to take a step back, especially whenever you're reading something that admittedly is as dark as this. I think this is a
Hmm.
darker book than people think.
Yeah.
It's nice to just see how they relate to the world around them
Hmm.
every now and then.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I remember reading that chapter and I was like, how does this relate? And I like there's like just that one line about how, this lady Justine drops him off. And you're like, oh, okay. So this is just like, an additional perspective that gives you more context to like, the world that we are in. And I loved, the whole part with Marnie and Steve, I think that's what their names are. So the two lesbian women who come in and Mosley's like reaction to that, and that was interesting. Um, I really loved that chapter, but I also really found it fascinating to read from Justine's husband, so Pitch, his father's perspective. That was one of the weirder chapters of the book, and I think really gave you insight into just certain people in the world,
Yeah.
if I may put it that way. And it was my brain just thinking about, we can get into a perspective like this is our worldview, and we think a lot of people share our worldview. And then we get to that moment when we're not in our echo chamber and we're faced with that person who is definitely not. And we know there are people out there, but being in their head is like a different visceral sort of
Mhm.
experience. And so that chapter was the most uncomfortable thing reading, but I couldn't stop reading that part, I think. How did you feel about that chapter?
I didn't like it.
Yeah.
Like I think that it's good that we got the perspective.
Hmm.
Um because like you said, we step out of an echo chamber
Hmm.
and literally like you get into the head of
Hmm.
this like racist old white dude who's like,
Hmm.
she's just after you for her money. She's just this
Hmm.
fucking
And the way he
little
refers to her as the Indian, as if she doesn't have a name. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I think like I said earlier with Mosley's chapter, I like seeing how they fit into different people's worlds.
Hmm.
Um but that one was like more personal, I think,
Hmm.
because like she's married to his son.
Hmm.
So he has this like visceral like
Hmm.
hatred for her for no reason.
Yeah.
I was just like, I don't like you. I want you to
Yeah.
die in the in the big firewall.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like I hated him so much, but I think it gave me even more compassion for Justine as a character because we get parts later on where we find out that she was nursing this horrible man as he was dying, and still cared because he was her husband's father, and she knew how much her husband cared for him. But again, it was just like, this just reminder of terrible people can still get away with so much, and good people don't always get what they deserve, and all of this. Yeah, it's a very
It made
bleak
me feel
thing,
the
but
same way that whenever I read The City We Became,
mm, love
getting
that book.
what's her name? The Staten Island girl.
Oh yes. Oh
Like
my
it
god.
reminds me of that, how
Yes,
you have like
actually.
all of these really like diverse marginalized characters who are going through all this
Yeah.
shit, and then you have like that one person who's like
Yeah.
wagging your finger and being like, I hate you because you
Yeah.
are black and you're wearing a hoodie. you know
Yeah.
like I
Yeah,
think
get off
that
my lawn. Yeah.
I don't think that it's like necessarily necessary to include a racist character in a book,
Yes.
obviously, but I do
Hmm.
think that with books that dive a little bit deeper into it, especially with authors
Hmm.
of color, I feel
Yes.
okay with it whenever authors of color do it because
Yes,
it's
agree.
not being racist, it's showing the realities of the situation.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I totally agree with that. Yeah, had this been like a white author doing this, I'd have been like, please stop. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna read this.
You're
But I think,
projecting.
yeah, yes, exactly. But I think getting it from the perspective of a, author of color writing this, I think, again, like you said, it goes a bit deeper. I think it's always amazing and wonderful and very needed to have, those positive and uplifting stories from marginalized perspectives, and getting to hear their stories and having the happy endings. And like, we get the, harshness of the world, but we don't need to viscerally show it from that perspective and have that racist perspective. But I think in the books, some of the ones that do go deeper and are trying to show this reality, I think it adds even more depth to the story, which I think to the city we became did really well. And I think she also did quite well with this chapter as well. Because it made me step back from everything that was going on. And I was like, this is even worse than I'm, thinking it to be. Um, yeah, so that's how I felt about that one. Yeah, it a lot of this has just made me think. And I think this book also is one that, like, I read and I've, definitely missed a lot of things on this read, but I'm, talking to you, I'm like, oh, picking up on more things and thinking about it more. And I definitely think it's one of those books that I will think of, continuously think about in the future. So I'm glad for that. And I love books that make me think about things. Um, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of like motherhood. Um, and the full theme that threads throughout the book, and how these three women think about it very differently as well, and how they approach their parenting. um I personally am very familiar with the Lula type character, very religious, very, in tune with certain values, but I loved how supportive she was of her daughter. I think the moment when they are faced with, like, they're not gonna be allowed to come to the services, I think, and everyone's just like ashamed of this fact that Justina is pregnant, and she agrees with her daughter, and she's like, no, it'll be fine, we're gonna do what you want. I loved that moment, but I also found it so interesting, just seeing how, I'm always saying her name wrong, Rini.
That's how
Rainy?
I said it.
Rini?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with that. Rini, I found it so interesting the part where we get where she decides to, I think, have her tubes tied. I'm not sure like what exactly she does, but she decides that she's not going to have children after the failed pregnancies. And I thought that it was an interesting choice to show like the very differences in these characters. Um, yeah, and I just loved it as a theme. And just with like everything that's going on right now, all of this was just making me think about that more. So yeah, it was just interesting. I have no, coherent, arguments to make about this, but I just thought it was
Right.
interesting. Yeah.
I don't know. I really did like the scene where they're sitting
Hmm.
in the church with Lula and
Hmm.
her daughter, and I from what I remember, the daughter doesn't say in the church that she was raped. She's just
Yeah,
like,
yeah, she doesn't say anything
I'm
about it.
I'm pregnant, like,
Yeah.
you know, and reading Lula being like, okay, well, we'll just do whatever you want.
Hmm.
I was like, okay, this is a woman who not only cares about her daughter, but understands. I think, like I said, it ties back to what I said
Hmm.
about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, the sexual violence that
Hmm.
they face. This is a woman who has been through the peak of it
Yeah.
because of the residential school. So she understands, like, you probably didn't have a say in this.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting to read from that perspective, especially coming from such a religious character.
Hmm.
It was
Yes.
very nice to see. It was very refreshing.
Yeah.
And then with Rini having her tubes tied,
Hmm.
um, I also kind of viewed it as a metaphor for like ending the generational trauma.
Yes. Yes.
Like she
Agreed.
was like, "This ends with me. We're
Yeah.
done," because I don't want to put my child through everything else and bring her into this world.
Hmm.
Granted, I have no say in, you know, I don't have a vagina. I don't have a say in the matter with that. But
Hmm.
I do think that reading it with the Cherokee context that I have,
Hmm.
it was meant to be a metaphor. That's at
Yes.
least how I interpreted it.
No, I definitely see that. I think, yeah, I saw it as like a reflection of her character, but also as like the metaphor as well. And I liked, that she should make that decision. Like, I think it added to the story for me. But yeah, again, like you were saying, coming from Lula as like a very religious character, I appreciated, what she does. And again, the fact that she doesn't question Justine about anything, again, like speaks to this idea. She's been through it and she knows. Um, and yeah, I think it was just fascinating. Yeah, I I love just reading different books that deal with this concept. I feel like abortions and babies from rape and these kinds of topics I don't see a lot in books. And so I'm always fascinated by it when it comes up in books. Um, but yeah, I'm trying to look at any other topics that I wanted to go over. Do you have any last things that you wanted to talk about or cover from the book?
I think that this is a very difficult book to read.
Hmm.
Um, Not just from like a technical aspect, like we talked about earlier, but it's
Yeah,
hard to read about rape and domestic
yeah.
violence and alcoholism and stuff. Um, I unfortunately see that a lot with Indigenous literature
Hmm.
because that's just the reality of the
Hmm.
world. And I don't want that to put anyone off of picking up Native books
Yes.
because that's something I see a lot. They're like, oh, these are all depressing. I'm like, well, I mean, look at the world.
Yeah.
Um,
We are a
I
dystopia.
Yeah. I also noticed a lot of people, not on Fable or anything, but just like in
Hmm.
general discussing this book, talking about how there weren't enough cultural aspects of it. They're like,
Oh, oh,
oh,
don't even get me
this didn't
started.
teach me anything about the American Indians. They didn't have dream catchers and I'm like, what I want a lot of people to understand is like, this
Hmm.
is a current narrative. Like the
Yeah,
ending of the book is set in 2012.
yeah.
And like I said earlier, it all ties back to me to colonization and the
Hmm.
residential schools. Because if your culture is stripped out of you,
Hmm.
it's not going to be as traditionally prevalent
Hmm.
in your descendants.
Hmm.
So I had a lot of people just that I saw saying like, oh well, this could have been like white and it would have been fine. Like, oh, this could have been
No,
any ethnicity, any race, and I'm like, but this is such a uniquely
unique.
indigenous experience of having your culture stripped away from you on your land, by the way, like
Hmm.
right
Yeah,
here. Um, so I books by authors of color are not meant to teach you anything, and I think that everyone
exactly.
who reads for this book club understands that. It's just more
Hmm.
like a general statement.
Yeah.
Because while I was reading those Goodreads reviews, I was getting mad. I
Oh
was
no,
like,
yeah, that's why I can't go on Goodreads for too long. It just makes me,
I
yeah,
was like, don't reply.
yeah. No, I totally feel that. I feel like I do that with every one of the books for this book club. I go on Goodreads just to, like, get a sense of like what the general population thinks, but then I stop after a little bit because I'm like, these are all authors of color, and there is always those people. And I think what you were saying just now about, we don't have to perform our heritage, our culture, whatever it is. And then again, colonialism is such a big part of this. Our cultures have been stripped away, especially in the indigenous context, like literally ripped away, killed away, everything. And you need to understand that context. I think so many people go into books with just like not thinking about the larger context of these books and these stories and these people. And so I think it's very ignorant to say, this could have just been anyone because this was actually a very specifically indigenous book. And everything that they go through is specifically tied to what their, people before them have gone through. Justine and Rini's stories are so heavily affected by what Lula went through and what her granny went through. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think everyone who's in this book club sort of understands that, like, we're going into these books with this broader perspective and understanding that there is so many factors that are affecting, these stories. But yeah, this is a contemporary story too, which I loved reading as well. And I think, um I'm have not been really great about picking up indigenous books, and this has just like made me want to pick up more as well. And I'm excited for those of you who are looking to pick up more. And I think someone asked for some recommendations, which
Here we go.
you,
Recommendations
yes,
are my bread and butter.
yeah,
Um, so if you want something more along the lines with this, I mentioned There by Tommy Orange, The
hmm
Break by Katarina Vermette. Um, let's see, I'm just looking at my shelves. I read a lot of horror. That's
hmm
primarily what goes on my channel. So Stephen Graham Jones is my Jesus Christ. Anything by Stephen Graham Jones. Apple in the Middle by Dr. Don E. Quigley. Rebecca Roanhorse, always great.
hmm
Especially if you like SFF. Let's see what else I got. A Lot Sway by Darcy Littlebadger. That's YA spec fic. And Sherry Demoline. Also, she
Oh
wrote The
yes,
Marrow Thieves and Empire of Wild.
yes.
That's probably like my tops.
Yes, amazing. Those are great. And for those of you who are going to watch this back later, just pause and re-listen to what Bear said, and you'll grab those recommendations. Also, I wanted to say, if anyone who grabbed Crooked Hallelujah, the physical copy, the author actually, or the publisher and author, added recommendations at the back as well. So there's like a whole list of them. I don't know if it's in all the copies, but it's in my copy. So there's a whole list, which I would recommend checking out.
It is not in mine. I
Oh
think this
yeah,
is a
okay,
first edition though. I think that
okay.
I got this very early,
Hmm.
so I don't know if it's probably in like
Okay.
newer editions.
Okay, yeah, yeah, totally. I think mine came with like a discussion guide and then with the suggested reading. So yeah, it's in some of the editions. I can type up the list and maybe post it on the comments of this video when if anyone wants to check that out later. But yeah, thank you so so much, Bear, for joining me today, for discussing this book with me, for sharing your perspective. I think that's my favorite part of these live shows, getting a perspective that's very different from my own, from the people watching, and hearing your stories and how you view these stories as well that we're reading. But overall, thank you everyone who joined today. The next book club pick is Rosewater by Tade Thompson, and we are going to be joined by Jerry from Onyx Books. I'm super excited for that discussion. So that'll be at the beginning of August. If you haven't picked up the book yet, go grab it. And I will see you all next time. And thank you so much, Bear.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. Bye, everyone.